How does business leadership, that forum, compare with Business Unity, of which you are the vice chairman? Do the two organizations work in tandem?
Business Unity South Africa is the umbrella, nationally mandated and representative business organization. A lot of adjectives, but essentially its task is to take the entire spectrum, small, medium, large, chambers of commerce, sectoral organizations, professional associations, the lot, and forge a common view on pieces of legislation, whether it is in NEDLAC, in Parliament, and on other business topics. We are a very focused CEO organization. We're unashamedly big business. We're not mandated. We do not claim to be representative, but we have a fair amount of heft and weight, and we can talk knowledgeably from the corporate perspective, particularly the big corporate perspective. So these are complementary, and we certainly work closely together.
You spent 20 years at Anglo-American, rising to the top ranks of that management team. Why did you decide to take the path that you've taken now and not continue to pursue a career at Anglo-American?
Look, 20 years is a very long time, and in fact in today's world that's almost unnatural. The notion of cradle to grave work, that's gone. I had the most exciting period, I think, in Anglo's history, particularly covering the transition. My portfolio covered clearly the government and international relations portfolio. We were right at the centre of South Africa's transition. There was nothing that Anglo was not involved with, and that extended through into the new democracy, into Anglo's listing. It then became a very different animal, and I'm very much a passionate South African. I'm very much wedded to resolving South Africa's challenges and working here. I could have gone on to a global career, but that's not something that I chose. And I also, I think, having had 20 years of the corporate rat race, decided to get off and run my own show, and I must say I'm finding that really, really rewarding.
But Michael, having been in a mining company for 20 years, do you find that you're somewhat sympathetic to the plight of the mining companies in the Business Leadership Forum with the 80 companies represented?
Clearly, my experience is most directly in the resource industries, but I do understand, I think, how large companies operate and think, and the pluses and minuses. I'm very clear-sighted. You know, I don't think that all is rosy in the garden of big companies, and we're reminded of that with the BB crisis. But I do think that overall, all things considered, they are a great force for good, and they are an absolutely essential part of development, whether it is in the north or the south. So I see a very positive role for them, but they do have to behave as corporate citizens, do the right things, and so on and so forth.
What's your view on black economic empowerment and the impact that it's having on corporate South Africa? Do you feel that it's working?
I was a very strong proponent, because I do think it was an absolutely essential step as part of our transition. I think the time has come for a review. I think it's been too narrowly interpreted, and I think that there have also been unintended consequences here. So
one of the consequences perhaps being just enriching an already elite group of black managers.
Well, yeah, you know, I prefer to think of it as a too narrow focus, too much just on ownership and control, too little on the broader societal impact. And we've mobilized a huge set of resources into a very narrow domain. Jenny Cargill, if I can give her a free punt, has just written a very interesting book which also argues strongly for the review of BEE, and I think that's what we should be doing now.
What do you feel it takes to be a good leader in South Africa specifically? Because certainly different skills are needed to navigate the corporate waters in this country.
I've always said that two qualities are necessary in South Africa. One is patience, and the second is a sense of humor. Because this is it's a robust baby democracy. It yells and squalls and screams, and we debate a lot. Things don't happen all that quickly, so you need the sense of patience. Clearly, there are all sorts of challenges too, so you also need a bit of a sense of humor to get you along. I do think you need a vision of where the society needs to be, and try to then be purposeful in terms of the activities. One of the difficulties, frankly it's a challenge for me and many of my colleagues, is that so much to be done and relatively few people who are at the top level, and the temptation is to spread yourself too thin. And however much you try to focus and draw back, you get tempted into a range of activities, and I think that makes for difficulties.
How involved should you be in those external activities? Because if we go back to the culture of Anglo-American, having spoken to a number of executives in that fold, they are encouraged to look beyond the problems associated with Anglo-American and to look at the broader problems of the country that they are working in. So how do you draw that line?
I'm a total believer in having a public service role as well. The trick is to manage it and not to end up churning across.
So that you can still be effective.
You've got to be effective, yes. And so choosing focus areas, learning to say no. I still haven't learned to do that. But you have to learn to say no. And sometimes even to people in high office who want you to do things, and you just got to say, my diary does not allow it.
How good are the other CEOs in the fold at saying no?
I think the effective ones have learned how to do it.
So it is all about focus. Do you think that the broader CEO grouping that you've got do feel very concerned about South Africa as a country rather than just focused on their own agendas?
There's a huge diversity. There are people at every level, from almost zero involvement probably to an overcommitment. I think the spirit is willing, often the flesh is weak. Finding the right way to intervene, that's always the trick too. How to be effective, as much as whether to be effective.
You've mentioned that legislation is one of the hurdles that this country is dealing with, unwieldy legislation that comes to the fore. What are the other challenges in your opinion? We've touched briefly on energy, on water.
We must talk about skills. The educational system really leaves a lot to be desired. Now that's true of many developing and in fact developed countries as well that have poor or relatively weak educational systems. What can business do without trying to take over government's responsibility? How can it be effective? It has to be involved. Certainly it should be involved at the technical skills level, the tertiary level, sponsoring chairs at universities. How far back does it go into supporting secondary and even primary school? These are unanswered questions. And there's no single solution, but we have to wrestle with that. Unemployment, I think, has got to be a major concern. Again, the answers are not obvious. If we knew how to do it, we'd all be doing it. But this society is not going to get to where it needs to if we do not crack that nut, if we don't make faster progress in finding industries, investments that are more labor intensive than they are at the moment. So this is a big concern of mine.
Another concern for the CEOs out there must be the current set of wage negotiations and unrealistic expectations on that front if we are going to try and keep jobs and bring down that 25.2% unemployment rate, which is at a 5-year high in South Africa.
And this is one of the trickiest challenges of all, to come from relatively affluent, privileged executives who are then saying to trade unions, you shouldn't be pushing so hard. Particularly in the public sector, unions are consuming all the resources for new employment, as well as their own current employees in terms of the current wage round. That simply can't be good. We can't make progress on that basis.
Do CEOs sometimes come to you as a forum with problems and then engage with their peer group to solve problems that may be specific to their company? Do you find that you almost mentor CEOs through crises?
Certainly, I think there's a lot of information exchanging, experience exchanging. They would tend to compare notes on some tricky issues, but of course they're very jealous about competitive advantage. So it's only up to a point where when there's anything that's proprietary in terms of knowledge, research, protecting your high caliber employees, then they would tend to say, no, that's off limits. So yes, there is some, but there are some pretty clear lines as to where it is drawn.
Where do you see business leadership 10 years out? What do you want the impact of this body to be on the South African economic environment?
I would like it to of course, be seen as a respected strategic thinker and catalyzer of action from the business community, a respected partner in national endeavours, and most certainly having contributed to our core project at the moment, which is the Vision 2040, to have got people interested and much more aligned on a set of national goals.
Vision 2040, we can't stop there. We need to elaborate on what that set of national goals is from your perspective.
Well, the sort of umbrella description is we took a phrase that President Zuma used last year when we reported back, having deliberated for a year on how to mitigate the impact of the financial crisis. And he said to us, I would like, in my lifetime, to be in a South Africa that is a developed, not a developing nation. We said that is a great objective because there are many countries that have done that. South Korea, for example, has moved from a country that was behind South African development to one that is ahead. So they've achieved pretty much developed country status in 30, 40 years. So we can do that. What do we need to do? That's precisely, if you have that as a shared goal, which offers something for all constituencies, you can begin to define the steps along the road to achieving that more easily. So the first thing is to agree on the goal, and then you can start this exercise of going towards that. Fortunately, we also have the National Planning Commission, Minister Manuel's Planning Commission. I think they're going to do some of these things too.
You mentioned earlier that it was easy to achieve consensus among the CEOs on crises such as energy, but that the rand was another issue entirely. Do you spend much time debating the rand, or do you just treat that as a no-go area because you're not going to achieve consensus? Some of your CEOs will want a weaker rand and others are quite happy with a strong rand.
No, I think it was important to have the debate, and we had a couple of pretty feisty sessions. But we've now tended to agree to disagree. The majority view goes with current policy, and that is to let the rand find its level, to use what tools and instruments Treasury and the Reserve Bank and others have, but generally not to try to use artificial, unsustainable mechanisms. Sustainability is something we're very keen on. And we're not a China. We're not a country with $2 trillion of reserves, or some fantastic amount. We've got a limited arsenal that we have to deploy very carefully. So we've kind of agreed to disagree on that, and now we move on.
When the debate circulated around the South African Reserve Bank's main mandate, be it focused on inflation targeting with that element of growth coming into the fold, where did most CEOs lie? Again, or did you leave that to the South African Reserve Bank to decide ultimately what their mandate was? No,
I think we've had views. We've participated in the debates at various levels. We clearly see the governor and others in the Reserve Bank from time to time. I think we feel that the consensus is with the status quo, and there's no real need to stir the pot too much on that. There are other battles, as we talked about earlier, that are more important.
Michael, you've set out Vision 2040. What personally are you looking for?
Well, what I would like to do, I have a very broad set of other interests as well, and I would in due course like to have more time to spend on those, whether they're personal interests or things like education, which I'm really quite passionate about.
Michael, thank you very much for your time. Michael Spicer, CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, here